Millionaire man mocks elderly flower seller, but then discovers she possesses something that all his money can't buy. He decides to follow her in secret, and what he sees changes his life forever. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the windows of the skyscrapers. On the 50th floor of the tallest building in the financial district, Eduardo Montero stood in front of the window of his office, his gaze fixed on the urban horizon. At 55, Eduardo was the very image of business success: an impeccable designer suit, a gold watch on his wrist, and an expression of perpetual disdain on his sharp face. The door of his office burst open, interrupting his thoughts. His assistant, a young woman with a nervous demeanor, rushed in. "Mr. Montero, the stocks have fallen 15% in the last hour. The board is requesting an emergency meeting," she announced with a trembling voice. Eduardo turned slowly, his gray eyes shining with a mixture of anger and determination. "Summon all the department heads. Now." The next hour was a whirlwind of shouting, accusations, and ruthless decisions. Eduardo, known for his hard-handed approach to business, didn't hesitate to point fingers and take drastic measures. "Incompetence. How could you let this happen?" he roared, slamming his fist on the boardroom table. "I want the entire risk analysis team fired immediately. And cut the marketing staff in half. If we can't recover these losses in 48 hours, more heads will roll." When the meeting ended, the silence in the office was deafening. Employees avoided making eye contact, fearful of attracting their boss's wrath. Eduardo returned to his office, slamming the door with a bang that echoed throughout the floor. He poured himself a glass of 30-year-old whiskey, a luxury he allowed himself on particularly stressful days. As the amber liquid slid down his throat, Eduardo reflected on his life. He had built his empire from scratch, sacrificing relationships, ethics, and sometimes even his own humanity in the process. But success had a price, and he was more than willing to pay it. The sound of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. It was his lawyer. "Eduardo, we have a problem with the acquisition of those lands on the outskirts. It seems there's a clause in the contract we hadn't foreseen." "Damn it, Ramon. I pay you a fortune to avoid precisely these kinds of surprises," Eduardo growled. "Fix it. I don't care how. Bribe whoever you need to bribe, threaten whoever you need to threaten. I want those lands." He hung up without waiting for a response. The day had been one disaster after another, and Eduardo felt the pressure weighing on his chest. He needed fresh air. He grabbed his Italian leather briefcase and left the office without saying goodbye to anyone. In the elevator, he found himself alone with a young employee who seemed on the verge of tears. Eduardo vaguely recognized her as part of the team he had just fired. "Mr. Montero, I wanted to tell you that," the girl began, her voice breaking. "Save it," Eduardo interrupted coldly. "Business is business. If you can't handle the pressure, perhaps you should look for work in a daycare." The elevator doors opened in the lobby, and Eduardo walked out without looking back, leaving the young woman sobbing silently. The afternoon air hit his face as he left the building. Despite it being spring, there was an unusual chill in the air. Eduardo adjusted his tie and began walking towards the parking lot where he had left his Aston Martin that morning. That's when he saw her for the first time. On the corner of the sidewalk, right in front of the entrance to the imposing skyscraper, there was a small flower stand. Behind the cart full of colorful bouquets stood a frail-looking elderly woman. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, but her eyes shone with surprising vitality. She wore simple, worn clothes, a wool shawl over her shoulders to protect herself from the cold. Eduardo frowned. How did they allow a street vendor to set up in front of such a prestigious building? It was a blemish on the urban landscape, he thought. He decided to ignore her and continue on his way, but at that moment, the old woman addressed him. "Good afternoon, sir. Would you like to take a bouquet to brighten up your home?" she asked in a soft voice with a kind smile. Eduardo stopped in his tracks, surprised by the woman's audacity. Didn't she realize who she was talking to? His suit cost more than everything this old woman owned. "My home," he responded sarcastically. "My home, as you call it, is a 20-room mansion with a team of professional decorators. I don't need your wilted flowers to brighten it up." The old woman's smile didn't falter at the harshness of his words. "Oh, I see. But sometimes, the simplest things bring the greatest happiness. Perhaps a flower could." Listen carefully, ma'am, Eduardo interrupted, his voice laden with contempt. I don't know who gave you permission to set up this third-rate stand here, but I suggest you pack up your things and leave. People like you don't belong in this place. The old woman seemed to shrink a little at his words, but she maintained her dignity. Everyone has their place in this world, sir. And each of us has something valuable to offer. Eduardo let out a bitter laugh. Something valuable? You. Please. Look at yourself. You're just an old woman selling wilted flowers on the street. What could you possibly have that would be of value to someone like me? Despite the insult, the old woman bent down and selected a beautiful red rose from her cart. She held it delicately, as if it were the most precious object in the world. Sometimes, the most valuable things can't be seen at first glance, she said, extending the flower towards Eduardo. Please, accept it. It's a gift. For a moment, Eduardo was paralyzed. There was something in the old woman's eyes, a mixture of compassion and wisdom, that disconcerted him. For a brief instant, he felt a twinge of guilt. Remorse. But as quickly as it came, the feeling vanished, replaced by irrational anger. I don't want your damn flower, he shouted, snatching the rose from the old woman's hand and throwing it to the ground. With a deliberate gesture, he stomped on the delicate petals, crushing them against the pavement. Passers-by stopped, watching the scene with a mixture of horror and fascination. Eduardo, blinded by his own rage, didn't notice the looks of disapproval or the murmurs of indignation. Do you think you can fix anything with a flower? That you can buy my sympathy? The world doesn't work that way, ma'am. The world belongs to the strong, to those of us who are willing to do whatever it takes to succeed. People like you, you're just obstacles in the path of progress. The old woman didn't respond. Instead, she bent down with difficulty to pick up the battered remains of the rose. Eduardo watched her, feeling inexplicably irritated by her calmness. Why don't you say anything? Don't you understand? Your presence here is an insult to everything this place represents. You should be grateful that I only destroyed one of your pathetic flowers and not your entire sorry excuse for a business. That's when it happened. As he stepped back, Eduardo stepped on one of the petals he had scattered on the ground. His Italian shoe with its smooth sole found no grip on the damp pavement, and before he knew it, he was falling. The impact was quick and forceful. His head hit the edge of the curb with a dull thud that seemed to resonate throughout the street. For a moment, everything went black. When Eduardo opened his eyes, the world around him was a blur of shapes and colors. He felt a sharp pain in the back of his head and a ringing in his ears that drowned out the sounds of the city. He blinked several times, trying to focus his vision. That's when he saw her. The old woman had knelt beside him, her wrinkled face full of genuine concern. She was saying something, but Eduardo couldn't understand the words. And then, for a brief instant, the old woman's face seemed to transform. The wrinkles softened, the gray hair turned dark brown, and the eyes, he knew those eyes well. Mom. Eduardo mumbled, confused and disoriented. The memory hit him with the force of an avalanche. His mother, who had passed away more than 2 decades ago, looking at him with that same expression of concern and unconditional love. He remembered her last words, spoken from the hospital bed, Eduardo, my son, don't let ambition darken your heart. True wealth is not measured in money, but in the kindness you give to the world. As quickly as it came, the vision vanished. His mother's face was replaced once again by that of the old flower seller, who was now trying to help him sit up. Eduardo, frightened and confused by what he had just experienced, got up abruptly, rejecting the woman's help. Without a word, he stumbled away towards his car, ignoring the concerned calls of the witnesses and the soft voice of the old woman asking him to wait. Upon reaching his Aston Martin, Eduardo frantically searched for the keys in his pockets. His hands were shaking, and his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Frustration, anger, shame, and, above all, an inexplicable fear. That's when he realized, the keys weren't there. In his rush to leave the office, he had left them on his desk. Damn it, he muttered, resting his forehead against the cold surface of the car. The bump on his head throbbed, reminding him of his humiliating fall. He would have to go back to the office, face the employees who surely would have heard about the incident by now, and worst of all, pass by the old woman and her flower stand again. With a sigh of resignation, Eduardo straightened up and began the walk back to the building. Each step was a reminder of his wounded pride and the strange experience he had just lived through. As he approached the entrance to the skyscraper again, Eduardo kept his gaze fixed on the ground, determined not to make eye contact with anyone, especially the old woman. However, a sound caught his attention, the inconsolable crying of a child. Almost against his will, Eduardo looked up. A few meters away, next to the flower stand, he saw a small boy no more than 5 years old. The child was crying desperately, looking around with eyes full of fear. And there, crouched in front of the child, was the old flower seller. Her voice, soft and melodious, reached Eduardo's ears. "Shoo, shoo, little one. Everything will be all right. We'll find your mom, don't worry." The old woman began to hum a song, a melody that Eduardo recognized instantly. It was the same lullaby his mother used to sing to him when he was a child, on those nights when nightmares woke him and the world seemed a frightening place. "Sleep, my child, sleep now. The bogeyman comes and will eat you." The old woman's voice, though cracked with age, conveyed a warmth and comfort that Eduardo hadn't experienced in decades. He watched as the child, little by little, stopped crying, hypnotized by the sweet melody and the comforting presence of the woman. "That's it, little one," continued the old woman, wiping the tears from the child's face with her worn handkerchief. "Now, can you tell me your name?" "Mateo," the boy responded between hiccups. "Mateo, what a beautiful name." "I'm Donna Rosa. Do you remember where you last saw your mom?" As the child described his mother and the place where they had separated, Eduardo remained motionless, observing the scene. There was something about the way the old woman, Donna Rosa, he mentally corrected himself, interacted with the little one that fascinated him. It was a mixture of patience, compassion, and wisdom that seemed to emanate from each of her gestures. It was a kindness that Eduardo hadn't experienced in years, perhaps decades. "Let's do something, Mateo," said Donna Rosa with a warm smile. "You'll stay here with me, next to my flowers, and together we'll wait for your mom. I'm sure she'll come looking for you very soon. In the meantime, how about you help me take care of the flowers?" The boy nodded, his eyes still wet but no longer fearful. Donna Rosa handed him a small sprayer and showed him how to gently spray the flowers to keep them fresh. Mateo devoted himself to the task with the seriousness that only a child can put into a game, his crying forgotten in the concentration of his new responsibility. Eduardo, without realizing it, had taken a few steps closer. The scene had captivated him completely, awakening memories and emotions he thought he had buried long ago. He remembered his own mother, the way she always had a kind word for everyone, even for those many would consider unworthy of attention. It was then that Donna Rosa looked up and her eyes met Eduardo's. There was no reproach in her gaze, no resentment for the treatment she had received minutes before. Instead, there was an understanding that Eduardo found disconcerting. It was as if this woman, with just one look, could see through all his defenses, through all the armor he had built over the years. "Sir," Donna Rosa said softly, "are you all right? That bump you took seemed quite hard." Eduardo found himself at a loss for words. How could this woman, whom he had insulted and humiliated, show concern for his well-being? Guilt, an emotion he wasn't familiar with, began to grow in his chest. I'm fine," he finally managed to say, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance. "Thank you for asking." Donna Rosa nodded, as if she understood much more than Eduardo was saying. "I'm glad. Sometimes, a little kindness is all we need to feel better, don't you think?" These words hit Eduardo with unexpected force. When was the last time he had shown kindness to anyone? When was the last time someone had been genuinely kind to him, expecting nothing in return? Before he could respond, a cry of relief broke the moment. A young woman was running towards them, her face a mixture of worry and joy. "Mateo!" "Oh, thank God!" The boy dropped the sprayer and ran to his mother, who lifted him in a tight embrace, tears of happiness running down her cheeks. Thank you," the woman repeated, looking at Donna Rosa with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for taking care of my son." Donna Rosa smiled, that smile that seemed to light up everything around her. "There's nothing to thank me for, dear. Anyone would have done the same." Eduardo, observing the scene, couldn't help but think that no, not anyone would have done the same. He certainly wouldn't have. The realization hit him hard, he had become someone who not only wouldn't help a lost child but would despise those who did. Mateo's mother, still holding her son, searched in her purse. "Please, let me give you something for your help." But Dona Rosa shook her head. "Keep your money, dear. Seeing a child reunited with his mother is all the reward I need. But if you insist on giving me something, how about a smile? Those are the most beautiful flowers we can grow in this world." The woman, moved, offered a radiant smile through her tears. Then, with a final thank you, she walked away with Mateo in her arms, the boy waving goodbye to Dona Rosa until they turned the corner. Eduardo found himself alone again with the elderly flower seller. The silence between them was charged with unexpressed emotions. For the first time in years, Eduardo felt truly ashamed of his actions. He began, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. How could he apologize for his behavior? How could he explain years of hardness and coldness? Dona Rosa looked at him with those eyes full of wisdom. "Sometimes," she said softly, "words are not necessary. Actions speak louder, don't you think?" Eduardo nodded, unable to maintain the old woman's gaze. He turned around, ready to return to his office, to his world of numbers and transactions where everything made sense, where he didn't have to face these uncomfortable emotions. But before taking a step, he stopped. Without turning, he asked, "How do you do it?" "How do I do what, sir?" Dona Rosa responded with genuine curiosity. "Be, like this," said Eduardo, making a vague gesture with his hand. "Kind, compassionate, even after how I treated you. Aren't you angry with me?" Dona Rosa let out a soft laugh, a sound reminiscent of the tinkling of bells in the wind. "Oh, dear. Life is too short to hold grudges. Every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about. Some wear their pain like armor, others hide it behind a smile. My job is not to judge, but to offer a little light where I can." Eduardo turned slowly, facing the old woman again. For the first time, he really looked at her. He saw the wrinkles on her face, each one a story of laughter and tears. He saw the way her hands, though wrinkled and stained by age, handled the flowers with infinite delicacy. And he saw in her eyes a peace he had never known. "And if one has forgotten how to be like that?" Eduardo asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How to be good?" Dona Rosa's smile softened, full of understanding. "It's never too late to remember, sir. Kindness is like a muscle, the more you exercise it, the stronger it becomes. Start with small acts, a smile to a stranger, a kind word to someone who needs it. And before you know it, it becomes as natural as breathing." Eduardo nodded slowly, processing the old woman's words. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring inside him, as if a wall he had built around his heart was beginning to crack. "Thank you," he finally said, the words sounding strange on his lips. "And I'm sorry. For everything." Dona Rosa nodded, accepting the apology with grace. "Apologies are like seeds, sir. Plant them with sincerity, water them with actions, and you'll see something beautiful grow." Eduardo looked around, noticing for the first time the beauty of the flowers surrounding the old woman. Each one was unique, perfect in its own way. Without thinking, he took out his wallet and extracted several high-denomination bills. "I want to buy all your flowers," he declared. Dona Rosa looked at him in surprise. "Sir, that's very generous, but..." Eduardo gently interrupted her. "Please, accept it. But with one condition, I want you to give them away. To every person who passes by here, give them a flower. Tell them it's a gift, that you hope it brightens their day." The old woman looked at him for a long moment, as if she were seeing beyond his exterior, to the very core of his being. Finally, with a smile that lit up her entire face, she nodded. "Very well, sir. It will be a pleasure to share this beauty with the world." Eduardo handed her the money and, for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, felt a spark of genuine joy. He turned to head back to his office, but before walking away, he looked over his shoulder. "Dona Rosa," he called, "I'll be here tomorrow. Maybe you could teach me more about your flowers." The old woman nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of joy and something that looked like hope. "I'll be here, sir. The flowers and I will be waiting for you." As Eduardo walked away, he felt as if something had changed inside him. The world seemed a little brighter, a little kinder. And for the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow with something that felt very much like hope. He entered the building, ignoring the curious looks from employees who had witnessed his fall and subsequent interaction with Donna Rosa. In the elevator, instead of avoiding eye contact as was his custom, he offered a small smile to the young employee he had fired that morning. "Miss," he said softly, "I'd like to speak with you tomorrow. I think I made a mistake this afternoon." The young woman looked at him in amazement, but before she could respond, the elevator doors opened on Eduardo's floor. He stepped out, but before the doors closed, he turned back to the employee. "Sometimes," he said, repeating Donna Rosa's words, "a little kindness is all we need to feel better." The doors closed, leaving the young employee confused but with a spark of hope in her eyes. Eduardo entered his office, his head still spinning from the day's events. He approached the window, looking down at the street where he could see Donna Rosa's small flower stand. Even from that height, he could make out the figure of the old woman, handing out flowers to surprised passers-by. He took out his phone and dialed a number. "Ramon," he said when his lawyer answered, "cancel the acquisition of those lands. I have a better idea for investing that money." He hung up before Ramon could protest. Then, he made another call. "Maria," he said to his assistant, "I need you to research local charities. Especially those working with the elderly and homeless children. And, cancel my meetings for tomorrow morning. I have an important appointment with a flower seller." As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in the same hues as Donna Rosa's flowers, Eduardo Montero sat in his leather chair, feeling as if he were waking up from a long dream. The world he had built around himself, made of power and money, suddenly seemed empty and meaningless. But there, on the sidewalk in front of his building, an elderly flower seller had shown him a different kind of wealth. A wealth made of kindness, of human connections, of small acts of love. And for the first time in years, Eduardo Montero smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and seemed to light up the entire room. Tomorrow would be a new day. A day to plant new seeds, to begin cultivating a different garden. A garden of the soul. And all thanks to an elderly flower seller, who with her simple presence and unshakable kindness, had achieved what seemed impossible, melting the ice-cold heart of the hardest man in the city. The following morning dawned with a different light for Eduardo Montero. For the first time in years, he woke up before his alarm went off, a feeling of anticipation fluttering in his stomach. He dressed carefully, opting for a less ostentatious suit than usual, and left his mansion with a determined step. Upon arriving at his office, he ignored the surprised looks from his employees at his early arrival and headed straight to his assistant's desk. "Maria," he said, his voice lacking its usual harshness, "do you have the information I asked you for yesterday about the charitable organizations?" Maria, still bewildered by this new Eduardo, nodded and handed him a folder. "Yes, Mr. Montero. I've compiled information on several local organizations that work with the elderly and homeless children, as you requested." Eduardo took the folder and briefly flipped through it. "Excellent work, Maria. Thank you." The word of gratitude left his lips with a naturalness that surprised even himself. Before heading to his office, he paused and looked at his assistant. "By the way, Maria, could you call Human Resources? I want them to review yesterday's layoffs. I think we were too hasty." Maria looked at him in amazement but nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. I'll take care of it right away." Once in his office, Eduardo approached the window. From there, he could see Donna Rosa's small flower stand on the sidewalk. The old woman was already there, arranging her flowers with the same care and love as always. Eduardo felt a smile forming on his lips, a sensation so unfamiliar it almost scared him. However, as the minutes passed, an uneasiness began to grow inside him. What was he doing? Was he really going to go down and talk to a flower seller? What would his partners, his employees say if they saw him fraternizing with someone like that? Doubt settled in his mind, and before he knew it, he had spent the entire morning watching Donna Rosa from his office window, unable to muster the courage to go down and talk to her. He saw how the old woman interacted with passers-by, always with a kind smile and a gentle word. He saw her console a young woman who seemed to be crying, offering her a flower and a hug. He saw her help an old man cross the street, holding his arm carefully and patiently. Each act of kindness he witnessed made something stir inside Eduardo. It was a mixture of admiration, confusion, and, though he hated to admit it, envy. How could someone who had so little materially give so much of herself? As the days passed, Eduardo's obsession with Dona Rosa grew. He cancelled important meetings, delegated responsibilities he would normally have handled personally, all to be able to spend hours watching the old woman from his window. His employees began to whisper, worried about this sudden change in their boss. Was he sick? Had he suffered some kind of nervous breakdown? No one dared to ask him directly, but the tension in the office was palpable. One afternoon, as Eduardo watched Dona Rosa close her flower stand, he made an impulsive decision. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of the office, ignoring his assistant's surprised questions. He went down to the street just in time to see Dona Rosa walking away with her flower cart. Without thinking twice, he began to follow her, maintaining a prudent distance so as not to be discovered. The old woman walked slowly through the city streets, occasionally stopping to rest or to exchange a few words with an acquaintance. Eduardo followed her like a shadow, his heart beating with a mixture of excitement and shame for what he was doing. After almost an hour of walking, Dona Rosa stopped in front of a dilapidated building in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Eduardo hid in a nearby alley, watching as the old woman greeted the doorman with familiarity before entering. He waited a few minutes before approaching the building. It was a sad place, with peeling paint and broken windows. Eduardo felt a pang of guilt as he thought of his own mansion, with its 20 rooms and full-time maintenance team. "Excuse me," Eduardo said to the doorman, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for an elderly lady who sells flowers. I think I saw her come in here." The doorman looked at him suspiciously. "You mean Dona Rosa? What business do you have with her?" Eduardo improvised quickly. I'm an old friend. I wanted to surprise her." The doorman seemed to relax a bit. "Ah, well. Dona Rosa lives on the 3rd floor, apartment 3C. But at this hour she's probably in the community room in the basement. She always helps with dinner for the residents." Eduardo thanked the doorman and entered the building. The interior was as depressing as the exterior, with damp-stained walls and a smell of mold that permeated the air. He followed the directions to the basement, the sound of voices and laughter guiding him. Upon reaching the door of the community room, Eduardo stopped short. Through the small window in the door, he could see a scene that left him breathless. The room was full of people, most of them elderly and children. At the center of it all, like the beating heart of that community, was Dona Rosa. The old woman moved between the tables, serving food, offering words of encouragement, laughing with the children. Eduardo watched as Dona Rosa approached a young mother holding a baby in her arms. The young woman looked distressed, and Eduardo could see how Dona Rosa spoke to her softly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. It was then that the young woman looked up, and Eduardo felt the world stop. He knew that face. Those eyes. That hair. "Lucia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. It was his daughter. The daughter he had thrown out of the house 5 years ago when she told him she was pregnant. The daughter whose name he had forbidden to be mentioned in his presence. The daughter he had erased from his life, convinced that she was a disgrace to his name. Eduardo staggered, leaning against the wall to keep from falling. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, guilt, remorse, fear. What was his daughter doing here? Why was she in a place like this? And that baby, was it his grandson? With his heart racing, Eduardo moved closer to the door, straining to hear the conversation. "I don't know what to do, Dona Rosa," he heard Lucia say, her voice broken by crying. "The baby has a fever again, and I can't afford more medicine. I lost my job last week and the money is running out." Dona Rosa hugged Lucia tenderly. "Don't worry, my child. We'll find a solution. God never gives us a burden we can't bear." Eduardo watched as Dona Rosa searched in her bag and pulled out a small bottle. "Here," said the old woman, handing it to Lucia. "It's the fever medicine. Use it for the baby." Lucia looked at the bottle in amazement. "But Dona Rosa, this is your medicine. The one you need for your heart. I can't accept it." Dona Rosa smiled, that smile that Eduardo had come to know so well. "My heart is fine, dear. What would make it sick would be knowing that this little angel is suffering when I can do something to help. Take it, please." Eduardo felt something break inside him. He saw his daughter, whom he had abandoned in her moment of greatest need, receiving more love and support from a stranger than from her own father. He saw Dona Rosa, who with so little, gave so much, even putting her own health at risk to help others. And then, as if the universe wanted to deliver the final blow, he saw the baby in Lucia's arms begin to stir. The little one started coughing violently, his face reddening from the effort. "No, no, no," cried Lucia, panic evident in her voice. "He's having another attack." Dona Rosa acted quickly, taking the baby in her arms. "Quick, we need cold water and a clean cloth. Someone call an ambulance." Chaos broke out in the room. People were running from side to side, looking for ways to help. Lucia was crying inconsolably, holding her son's hand while Dona Rosa tried to calm him. Eduardo stood paralyzed, his hand on the doorknob. He could enter, reveal his presence, offer his help, his money, whatever was necessary to save his grandson. But fear paralyzed him. Fear of rejection from his daughter, fear of facing the consequences of his past actions, fear of the look of disappointment he would surely see in Dona Rosa's eyes. The seconds passed, each one an eternity. Eduardo could hear the baby's labored breathing, Lucia's sobs, Dona Rosa's words of encouragement. And then, he made a decision. With a sudden movement, he opened the door and entered the room. All eyes turned to him, but Eduardo only had eyes for his daughter and the baby in Dona Rosa's arms. I can help," he said, his voice trembling but firm. I'm the child's grandfather." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Lucia looked at him with a mixture of shock and fear, as if she were seeing a ghost. Dona Rosa, for her part, observed him with an indecipherable expression, the baby still stirring in her arms. Eduardo stepped forward, taking out his phone. "I have a private helicopter. I can take us to the best hospital in the city in minutes. Please, let me help." Lucia seemed about to protest, but Dona Rosa intervened. "This is no time for doubts, dear. Your son needs urgent medical attention." With a trembling nod, Lucia agreed. Eduardo made the call, his authoritative voice returning as he gave orders for the helicopter to be ready immediately. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Eduardo guided Lucia, Dona Rosa, and the baby to the building's rooftop, where the helicopter was already waiting for them. The trip to the hospital was tense, with Eduardo watching helplessly as Dona Rosa and Lucia cared for the baby, whispering words of encouragement and prayers. At the hospital, a team of doctors was ready to receive the little one. Eduardo used all his influence to ensure he received the best possible care. While the doctors worked, Eduardo, Lucia, and Dona Rosa waited in silence in a private room. It was Dona Rosa who finally broke the silence. "Eduardo," she said softly, "I think you have a lot to explain." Eduardo nodded, feeling the weight of years of mistakes on his shoulders. He looked at his daughter, who was watching him with a mixture of emotions in her eyes. "Lucia," he began, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was a monster. I failed you when you needed me most. There's no excuse for what I did." Lucia didn't respond, but tears began to run down her cheeks. Eduardo continued, the words coming out like a torrent. "When you told me you were pregnant, I could only think about how it would affect my reputation, my business. I didn't see my daughter asking for help, I saw a problem that needed to be eliminated. And in the process, I lost the most valuable thing I had." Eduardo looked at Dona Rosa, who was watching him with compassion. "It was this woman, this incredible woman, who made me realize how empty my life was. How wrong I was. And it was she who, without knowing it, led me back to you." Lucia finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Why now, Dad? Why after 5 years?" Eduardo shook his head, tears forming in his eyes. "Because I was a coward. Because I was so lost in my own world of money and power that I forgot what truly mattered. But now I see everything so clearly, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but if you give me the chance, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for my mistakes." Lucia sobbed softly, and for a moment, Eduardo feared she would reject him. But then, to his surprise, his daughter stood up and hugged him tightly. Eduardo wrapped her in his arms, tears flowing freely down his face. "I missed you so much, Dad," Lucia whispered. It was such difficult years. Eduardo hugged her tighter. I know, sweetheart. And I'm so sorry. But I'm here now, and I promise I'll never abandon you again. Donna Rosa watched the scene with a soft smile, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Eduardo looked at her over his daughter's shoulder. Donna Rosa, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. You have changed my life in a way I never thought possible. The old woman shook her head. It wasn't me, Eduardo. It was your own heart that guided you here. I was just in the right place at the right time. Before Eduardo could respond, a doctor entered the room. Everyone held their breath, waiting for news about the baby. The child is stable, announced the doctor with a smile. The fever has gone down and his breathing has normalized. With proper treatment, he will recover completely. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Lucia collapsed in her chair, sobbing with joy. Eduardo knelt beside her, holding her hand. Can I see him? Eduardo asked timidly. Lucia nodded, wiping away her tears. Yes, Dad. I think it's time for you to meet your grandson. Together, they entered the hospital room where the little one was resting. Eduardo approached the crib, his heart beating fast. The baby was sleeping peacefully, his little chest rising and falling with each breath. He's beautiful, Eduardo whispered, extending a trembling hand to gently touch the baby's cheek. What's his name? Lucia smiled. His name is Eduardo, after his grandfather. Eduardo felt his heart swell with emotion. He looked at his daughter in amazement. You gave him my name? After everything I did, Lucia nodded. Because despite everything, I never stopped loving you, Dad. And I always had hoped that one day you would come back into our lives. At that moment, little Eduardo opened his eyes. He looked directly at his grandfather and, to everyone's surprise, smiled. Eduardo felt something melt inside him. All the hardness, all the coldness he had cultivated for years, dissolved in the face of his grandson's innocent smile. In that instant, he knew his life would never be the same again. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. Eduardo temporarily moved to a hotel near the hospital, determined to be present for every moment of his grandson's recovery. He spent hours in the hospital room, talking with Lucia, getting to know his grandson, and trying to make up for lost time. Donna Rosa visited them regularly, bringing fresh flowers to brighten up the room and words of encouragement for everyone. Eduardo watched in amazement as the old woman interacted with nurses and other patients, leaving a trail of smiles and comfort in her wake. One afternoon, while little Eduardo was sleeping and Lucia had gone home to rest for a bit, Eduardo found himself alone with Donna Rosa in the hospital cafeteria. Donna Rosa, Eduardo began, his voice laden with emotion. I don't know how to express my gratitude. You not only saved my grandson's life, but you also saved mine. The old woman smiled, her eyes shining with wisdom. Eduardo, life gives us second chances in mysterious ways. The important thing is to recognize them and take advantage of them. Eduardo nodded, thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot these days. About my life, my priorities. I've realized how empty I was, how wrong I was. I want to change, Donna Rosa. I want to be better. Change begins with small steps, Eduardo, Donna Rosa responded. You can't erase the past, but you can build a different future. That's exactly what I want to do, Eduardo said with determination. I've made some decisions. I'm going to sell my mansion and move to a place closer to Lucia and the baby. And I want to use my money to make a real difference. Donna Rosa looked at him curiously. What do you have in mind? Eduardo smiled, a glimmer of enthusiasm in his eyes. I want to create a foundation. One that helps single mothers and their children, that provides housing, medical care, and educational opportunities. And I want you to help me run it, Donna Rosa. No one knows the needs of the community better than you. The old woman seemed surprised for a moment, but then smiled widely. Oh, Eduardo, that's a wonderful idea. There are so many Lucias out there who need help. Exactly, Eduardo nodded. And I want to start with the building where you live. I'm going to buy it and completely renovate it. No one will have to move, but everyone will have a safe and dignified home. Donna Rosa took Eduardo's hand in hers. You've come a long way in a short time, Eduardo. I'm proud of you. Eduardo felt a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, Dona Rosa. For everything. For showing me that true wealth is not in money, but in the heart." At that moment, Lucia entered the cafeteria, her face lighting up as she saw her father and Dona Rosa together. "What are you two talking about?" she asked with a smile. Eduardo looked at his daughter, feeling a wave of love and gratitude. "About the future, sweetheart. A bright future for all of us." As the three of them returned to the hospital room, Eduardo realized that, for the first time in years, he felt truly happy. He had his daughter back, a grandson to love, and a new mission in life. And all thanks to a humble flower seller who had taught him the true meaning of wealth. That night, as he watched his grandson sleep peacefully, Eduardo made a silent promise. He promised to be the man his family deserved, the man that Dona Rosa had seen in him even when he couldn't see it himself. He promised to use his wealth and influence to make the world a better place, one act of kindness at a time. And as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in the same colors as Dona Rosa's flowers, Eduardo Montero knew that his life had changed forever. He was no longer the cold and calculating man he once was. Now he was a man with a purpose, a man with love in his heart. The millionaire who had mocked an elderly flower seller had discovered that she possessed the most valuable wealth of all, a heart full of love and compassion. And now, thanks to her, he too had found that wealth within himself. As he closed his eyes, Eduardo smiled. Tomorrow would be a new day, the first of many in his new life. A life dedicated to family, to love, and to making the world a better place. And all thanks to an elderly flower seller who had changed his life forever. The days following the dramatic night at the hospital were a whirlwind of emotions and changes for Eduardo Montero. Each morning, he woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer the cold businessman obsessed with numbers and profits. Now he was a man on a mission to rebuild his life and repair the damage he had caused. Eduardo spent his days divided between the hospital, where his grandson was recovering rapidly, and long conversations with Lucia, trying to rebuild the bridge he had burned 5 years ago. Every word, every gesture, was an attempt to prove that the change in him was real and lasting. One afternoon, while Lucia was dozing in the chair next to the baby's crib, Eduardo found himself alone with Dona Rosa in the hospital hallway. "Dona Rosa," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I can't express how much I owe you. You have changed my life in a way I never thought possible." The old woman looked at him with those wise eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul. "Eduardo, the change was within you all along. I just helped you find it." Eduardo nodded, thoughtful. "Still, I want to do something to thank you. Something that really makes a difference." Dona Rosa smiled softly. "The best way to thank is to live life with love and compassion. Use your wealth to do good, Eduardo. There are so many people who need help." Those words resonated deeply with Eduardo. At that moment, he made a decision that would change not only his life but the lives of many others. The next day, Eduardo called a meeting in his office. His employees entered cautiously, still bewildered by the recent changes in their boss's behavior. To their surprise, they found Eduardo sitting not at his imposing desk, but in a circle of chairs next to a kindly smiling old woman. "Thank you all for coming," Eduardo began. "Let me introduce you to Dona Rosa. She has taught me an invaluable lesson about true wealth in life." Eduardo proceeded to explain the events of the past few days, his voice occasionally breaking with emotion. He spoke of his daughter, his grandson, and how he had been blind to what really mattered in life. "From today," he announced, "our company is going to take a new direction. We are going to create a foundation dedicated to helping single mothers and homeless children. We will provide housing, medical care, and educational opportunities." The silence in the room was palpable. The employees looked at each other, amazed by this transformation in their once unrelenting boss. "I know this is a drastic change," Eduardo continued. "And I understand if some of you prefer to seek other opportunities. But for those who want to be part of this new chapter, I promise that together we will make a real difference in the world." To Eduardo's surprise, his employees not only accepted the change but embraced it with enthusiasm. Many had ideas and suggestions on how they could contribute to the company's new mission. In the following weeks, Eduardo worked tirelessly to make his vision a reality. He sold his mansion and moved to a modest apartment near the hospital where his grandson was still recovering. He used a large part of his personal fortune to buy and renovate the building where Lucia and Donna Rosa lived, ensuring that all residents could stay there in much better conditions. The foundation grew rapidly, with Donna Rosa as its heart and soul. Her knowledge of the community and her innate compassion guided every decision. Eduardo, for his part, contributed his business skills and connections, ensuring that the foundation had the necessary resources to make a real impact. One day, as Eduardo and Donna Rosa toured the renovated building, now full of happy families and children playing in a clean and safe courtyard, the old woman stopped and took Eduardo's hand. "Do you see, Eduardo?" she said with a smile. "This is true wealth. It's not measured in money, but in the lives we touch and improve." Eduardo nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that he once would have mistaken for weakness, but now recognized as genuine love and satisfaction. As they continued their tour, they came to the small community garden they had created on the building's roof. There, among rows of vegetables and herbs, was a beautiful rose bush. Eduardo stopped in front of it, remembering the rose he had trampled on that fateful day. "Donna Rosa," he said softly, "I would like this rose bush to bear your name. As a constant reminder of the beauty and kindness you have brought into our lives." The old woman looked at him with eyes bright with emotion. "Oh, Eduardo, that's very sweet. But remember, roses need constant care to flourish. Just like the kindness in our hearts." Eduardo nodded, understanding the depth of her words. "I promise I'll take care of it every day, just as I'll take care of the gift you've given me, a second chance in life." That night, Eduardo returned to the hospital to visit his daughter and grandson. Lucia greeted him with a smile, something that still seemed like a miracle to him after so many years of separation. "Dad," Lucia said, "the doctor says we can take Eduardo home tomorrow." Eduardo felt his heart swell with joy. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. And speaking of home, I have a surprise for you." He took a set of keys from his pocket and handed them to Lucia. "It's the apartment next to Donna Rosa's. It's fully furnished and ready for you and the baby to move in when you're ready." Lucia looked at the keys in amazement. "Dad, I don't know what to say." Eduardo hugged her tightly. "You don't have to say anything, my love. I just want you to know that I'm here for you and my grandson. Always." As he hugged his daughter, Eduardo looked out the hospital window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same colors as Donna Rosa's flowers. He thought about how much his life had changed in such a short time, all thanks to a humble flower seller who had seen beyond his tough guy facade and touched his heart. The next day, when little Eduardo was discharged, the whole community gathered to welcome him home. Donna Rosa was there, of course, with a bouquet of fresh flowers and a radiant smile. As Eduardo held his grandson in his arms, surrounded by his daughter, Donna Rosa, and all the residents of the building he now considered his extended family, he realized that he had found something that all his money could not have bought, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of unconditional love. He looked at Donna Rosa, who returned his gaze with a glimmer of pride in her eyes. Without words, Eduardo conveyed his eternal gratitude. The old woman nodded, understanding. At that moment, Eduardo Montero knew that his life had changed forever. He was no longer the lonely, bitter millionaire who mocked an elderly flower seller. Now he was a man rich in the things that really mattered: family, love, and the ability to make the world a better place. And all thanks to a rose, a smile, and the unshakable kindness of an old woman who had taught him the true meaning of wealth. As the sun set over the city, Eduardo looked around at the smiling faces of his new family and community, and knew that this was just the beginning of a life full of purpose and love. A life that would honor Donna Rosa's legacy, one flower at a time.